Good afternoon, and welcome to our BA Speaker Series. I'm Vicki Palmer, Finance Chair of the Black Economic Alliance Board. Our entire board is ecstatic that so many of you have joined us today for this important discussion. As we move ever closer to election 2020, there is greater than normal angst around voter turnout and voter suppression in the midst of this unprecedented pandemic. The BEA is committed to safeguarding the 2020 elections, which includes educating, mobilizing, and protecting the safety of voters, particularly Black voters, to elect leaders who will advance the Black economic agenda. We are truly honored and excited to have these two powerhouse women for this important discussion on voter suppression. Let me begin by introducing Stacey Abrams. I've had the pleasure of knowing Stacey since she was about 19 years old. My first year as a member of the Spelman College Board of Trustees was Stacey's sophomore year at Spelman, and she was student trustee. After her first presentation to the board, there was pretty general consensus that this young woman is going to rule the world one day, and I rest my case. Best-selling author, 11 years in the Georgia State Legislature, 7 of those as majority leader. First woman in the United States to win her party's gubernatorial nomination. Needless to say, I was aggressively and passionately involved in her campaign, and I truly shared her heartbreak. However, I'm so proud that she chose to keep moving forward for change and founded Fair Fight to promote fair elections across our nation, and then Fair Count to ensure greater participation in the 2020 census. The Washington Post just published an inspiring article called The Power of Stacey Abrams, not to be missed. Welcome, Stacey, and thank you for your never-ending commitment to change. It is now my privilege to introduce our other special guest. Sherrilyn Ifill, I know you by reputation and personal admiration. Sherrilyn is President and Director, Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Early in her career, she served as Assistant Counsel for LDF, where she litigated voting rights cases. Little did she know then that she would return one day in such a powerful way. She left LDF and spent 20 years teaching at the University of Maryland School of Law, still fighting for civil rights. Under Sherrilyn's leadership, LDF has intensified its litigation, challenging voter suppression, racial discrimination in criminal justice and housing, and also challenging unconstitutional policing policies. Suffice it to say, since she took the helm at LDF in 2013, Sherrilyn Ifill has emerged as one of the nation's leading voices in the fight for racial justice and equality. I'm especially pleased to note there are numerous ties between the BEA, Fair Fight, and LDF. Thank you, Stacey and Sherrilyn. And now it is my pleasure to present our moderator for today's session, BEA board member and CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, Wes Moore.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the wonderful intro, Vicki, and to everybody. Good afternoon, and it is absolutely my pleasure to serve as moderator for this fantastic conversation. When we talk about people who are not just helping to shape how we think about the world, but also defining the world in which we live in, there are not two names that go above the names of Sherrilyn Ifill and also Stacey Abrams. So to both of you, thank you so much, and it's great seeing you again. And it's an honor to be able to have this conversation also in the context of BEA. Because as everybody knows, the focus for BEA is really economic prosperity for Black Americans with a focus on work and wages and wealth, all of which are under attack as we speak right now. But there might be some people who are saying, well, what does this have to do with some of the issues that we'll discuss today, such as voter fraud and voter suppression? And the answer is everything. The answer is it's about how we're thinking about disenfranchisement and how we're bringing people into this conversation. And there's no two people who can help to articulate that and who are on the front lines and fighting that more than Sherrilyn and Stacey. And so maybe the first question that I'll throw out, and maybe I'll start with you, Stacey, is the question of when people say, what exactly is voter suppression? Oftentimes people think there's a singular answer or a singular thing to look for. But when you were asked that question, what exactly is voter suppression? What is your response to that?
So voter suppression, first of all, I want to say thank you to the BEA for having me. Thank you to Vicki Palmer for such a generous introduction and for putting up with me for so many years. And of course, thank you, Wes, for agreeing to be the moderator. Voter suppression exists anytime an eligible citizen is impeded from casting their vote, but it happens in basically 3 buckets. The first bucket is, can you register or stay on the rolls? That encompasses the challenges we've seen in Florida, in Georgia, and Tennessee, where laws have been passed to make it more difficult for third-party groups to register voters of color, in part because voters of color are twice as likely to register if they're registered by a third party. It's the issue of where you can be registered. Look at states like Texas that have put limits on where you can actually be registered to vote. And then it's, can you stay on the rolls? And that is purges, like in the state of Georgia, the state of Ohio. Ohio has the highest purge rate in the nation. But we need to understand that the purging of voters, the removal of voters, not because they have moved or because they've died, but because they simply haven't voted in a certain number of elections. There are 9 states with laws that allow you to be removed from the rolls for that purpose, but there are 44 states that use some version of that practice. So the first bucket is, can you register and stay on the rolls? The second bucket is, can you get access to a ballot? In Georgia, in Texas, in Michigan, across the country, this challenge comes about in part because of voter ID. In this country, almost every state requires some form of identification. But the issue is, how strict is that form of identification and how accessible is it for the average voter? And we know that, for example, in Wisconsin and in Pennsylvania, Georgia and South Carolina, they've put together forms of voter ID that are more difficult to access, which means you are limiting the people who can actually get a ballot because they have to present an ID in order to secure a ballot. A second example of it is polling places. When polling places shut down, especially in rural communities or in communities without public transportation, the closure of polling places means you can't access the ballot. And a third example is what we're facing right now with mail-in ballots. In the midst of COVID-19, if you live in a state that requires you to have an excuse before you can access absentee balloting or voting by mail, and they don't accept that a pandemic is a legitimate excuse, then you can't access your ballot. And so it's, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you access a ballot? And then the third is, can you make sure your ballot is counted? I like to call that Florida. So it's all those states where you go through the process, you jump through the hurdle of getting on the rolls, you jump through the hurdle of getting access to your ballot, and you get to the place where either the machines are broken. We saw what happened in Mississippi in 2019, where the names of the candidates flipped. The same thing happened in 2018 in Georgia in my election. But it's also the ritual throwing out of votes by people of color, largely African Americans and Latinos. When their absentee ballots come in, they get thrown out because of things like signature mismatch laws, which say that your signature has to look the same as the one they have on file, regardless of when you sign that piece of paper. I like to say my signature doesn't match from CVS to Kroger, let alone from when I signed my first piece of paper when I was 18 to today. But it's also whether you are given an inordinate number of provisional ballots, which tends to happen again to people of color. This was a device that was designed to make it easier for people to vote if they were eligible, but it's been weaponized particularly against low-income communities and communities of color. And so they get through the entire gauntlet and they find that they have to come back within 3 days with proof that they probably can't secure any time, and their ballots are then thrown out. So can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast your ballot, and can your ballot be counted? And the way to understand this is that we don't have a single set of rules in this country. We have 50 different states that administer 50 different types of elections at any given moment. And that lack of uniformity, but also the delegation of that authority to the states, means that states that do things well, do things great, and states that do things poorly can steal the right to vote from thousands, if not millions of Americans.
And so Sherrilyn, and along those lines, and I say, Sherrilyn is not just a dear friend, but also a neighbor. down in Baltimore, and I know, you know, and I know we've seen you in this fight for a long time, making real impact. But I think it highlights something that Stacey was just talking about, right? This idea that this is not just about how do we get more people to register. This is not just about, there's not just an education component to this. This is all, there are laws that are currently sitting in place in states and jurisdictions that are actually making it less likely that we can actually have a voice that is heard. Can you talk a little bit about the work that LDF is doing along those lines? And what do we mean by that there are laws in place that we actually have to push back against?
Yeah, thank you so much, Wes. And thank you, Stacey, for that very comprehensive explanation of voter suppression. And thank you all for joining the conversation today. Listening to Stacey, I was struck by the fact that we have to put this for a minute into some context so that we understand how we got here. In your introduction, Wes, you said, you know, people may wonder, what does voting and voter suppression have to do with the core work of the BEA? And I like to remind people that the great voting rights movements of the civil rights movement in the late 1950s and early 1960s that focused on voting not just for the ceremonial or citizenship aspect of being able to cast a ballot. Certainly there are dignity interests that are in play, and there are citizen interests that are in play in terms of being able to cast your vote. But those people in jurisdictions all over the South who were willing to risk their lives for the right to vote did so because they believed that voting would allow them to change the material conditions of their lives. They believed that political power and being able to exercise political power, and remember in many of these counties, African Americans were a majority of the population, would allow them to change the sharecropping system that they were under, would allow them to change the material conditions of their life. When Thurgood Marshall retired from the Supreme Court and he was asked what was his most important Supreme Court case, of course that question was the softball. He was supposed to begin talking about Brown versus Board of Education. But in fact, Thurgood Marshall talked about Smith versus Allwright, a case he won in the Supreme Court in 1944, which ended the all-white Democratic primary. In those days, Democrats controlled the South, and they were principally the people involved in voter suppression. And Marshall, LDF, challenged the Democratic Party's use of an all-white primary. That used to decide who got elected, the primary election, and Blacks were not allowed to cast their votes. And that had to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and that case was won in 1944. And Marshall thought that case was so important because he believed that alongside education, political power was vitally important for African Americans to be able to break the back of Jim Crow. So I want to first situate, you know, this conversation squarely into the center of the concerns of the BEA. And then secondarily, what struck me listening to Stacey, and frankly, I found so kind of depressing, was all of the buckets she described, the three buckets. Those of us who have been voting rights litigators for a long time, I've been doing this for 30 years, we used to describe those as what we called first generation voting rights problems. Registration, the kinds of things we saw in the civil rights movement, right? Being asked to count how many beans are in a jelly bar, in a bottle of jelly beans, having to do understanding clauses, paying poll taxes, all of those things that were designed to keep you from being able to register and cast the ballot, voter intimidation, all of those things we think of as first generation problems, the ability to cast the ballot. And the truth is, by the time I was in the flush of litigating as a young LDF lawyer, we had moved on principally to second generation voting rights problems. And the reason we were able to move on was because we had Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was so important that it has largely been regarded as the most successful aspect of any piece of civil rights legislation, because it was a mechanism that allowed you to catch discrimination before it happened. And every jurisdiction covered by the formula under Section 5 could not make a voting change, could not decide to purge votes, could not decide to move a polling place, could not decide to impose a voter ID law without first getting that proposal cleared by a federal authority, usually the Attorney General of the United States, or by the federal district court in the District of Columbia. And that pre-clearance mechanism allowed us to get our hands around these first generation challenges and focus on the second generation challenges, which is the restrictions on Black power once you cast the vote, like at-large elections or racial gerrymandering. right? So that was kind of the meat and potatoes of what we were doing in the voting rights litigation world. But when the Supreme Court struck down the core of Section 5 in 2013, it hurtled us back in time to these first generation issues. And worse, those first generation issues now were no longer limited to the southern jurisdictions where most of us had done our work, and where Section 5, the Section 5 coverage formula was in play. And of course, Section 5 wasn't only in the South. 3 boroughs in New York City were covered by Section 5, and certain counties in California. But largely it was focused on the South, the entire state of Georgia, the entire state of Texas, Arkansas, and so on. We had been able to move to second generation, and now we were hurtled back. And not only were we hurtled back, but now it had begun to metastasize across the country. So you had a Wisconsin voter ID law and a Kansas voter ID law, right? And you saw Ohio's voter purges. And now this began to creep across the country as other jurisdictions began to recognize that they too could use these tactics that had traditionally been used by Southern jurisdictions to keep African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans from being able to participate fully in the political process. So I want to be clear that now the work for LDF has been first generation, back to first generation, and still doing second generation work, still challenging vote dilution, still challenging racial gerrymandering. But the core work, particularly this year in an election year, and as we have seen these first generation challenges increase, is going back to the drawing board. And so it's been the voter ID litigation that we had to bring and challenge in Texas. It's the cases that we filed, just in the last 4 weeks in South Carolina, in Alabama, in Louisiana, in Arkansas, seeking to expand absentee voter access during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have had to return to this fundamental voting rights litigation, and we've had to add it to our existing docket of second generation cases. And that's the landscape we face right now in terms of the headwinds that are facing Black political power and therefore transformation in Black communities.
And what's really, I think about what you just said in many of the states that you just mentioned, where a lot of these states, these are also states, when you think about even the founding and the forming of BEA, where these are states where a strong African-American turnout can actually change the tide of an election.
Yes.
By being able to get people out and have people heard and their voters and their votes count can actually change and shift the direction of an election. And so I think about it. And so let me pose this question to you, Stacey, as you're thinking about as we're going into 2020. And particularly now in this era of post-COVID, this era of mail-in balloting, these other things that are now going to be new for us to think about, not just on a regional, but on a national perspective. How are you thinking about this in context of that? How are you thinking about this in context of the fact that we have new barriers, we have new hurdles that we now have to overcome to be able to shape and shift elections and making sure that voices are actually heard in these contests?
Well, I think the first responsibility is to meet people where they are. We have this tendency to believe that because we know it, the world knows it. And when it comes to voter suppression, one of the most insidious and effective means is that people see it as user error. They assume that they made a mistake, that they didn't understand, that they didn't do. And it's so labyrinthine and so complex, but also so counterintuitive, people will usually give up rather than try to beat against the system. And so our first responsibility, which is what I've been focused on for the last 2 years, is actually talking about voter suppression. If we don't talk about it, people don't understand it. And if we do not call it by its name, then what will happen is that someone will assume, I should have done this, or worse, they'll blame each other for inaction as opposed to holding the system and those in charge of the system accountable. So our first responsibility is to call it by its name. And the second is to connect the dots. I fight for voting rights, not because the act of voting is so special. I mean, it is, but that's not the purpose. It's the power that's embedded in the right to vote. And that power is what we often elide in our conversations. We talk about it as a sacrificial act. We should do it because of the Voting Rights Act. We should do it because of the Civil Rights Movement. No, people fought for the right to vote for the power to change their lives. And what Sherrilyn was referencing is what we should be talking about today. 58% of the Black community in America lives in the South. We are also the most likely to die of COVID-19. We are the least likely to be able to recover our jobs and our health. if there is a post-COVID moment. And if we do not talk about the infrastructure issues that led to us not only contracting the disease at a higher level, but dying from it at a higher level and having the least resilience to recovery, then we are going to not only miss the opportunity to leverage this voting moment, we're going to lose the opportunity to shape the next generation of Americans. Because what we are facing is an unprecedented assault that is not simply coming from the act of blocking the vote, but by an active intent by those who are in charge right now to not serve the population that is the most susceptible to both contraction and death, but also from economic disparity. And so the next piece is that we have to be having real conversations, not simply with those in charge, but those who are those essential workers, who are the sanitation officers at the hospital, who work in the Krogers and the organizations where they don't have a choice but to show up. And more importantly, those who have lost those jobs, those childcare workers who are now completely out of jobs, and those entrepreneurs who in the first round of PPP did not get a single dime. Only 10% of Black business owners received funding from the Paycheck Protection Act. And so the way I think about this is that we begin with the conversation of what they're trying to stop, but we then have to talk about why they're trying to stop us from participating. And then we have to do the third part, which is fight for access. That's why the HEROES Act is so important. That $3.6 billion that passed in the HEROES Act that pays for elections, pays for Black participation, because we have to be able to vote by mail. We have to have the education to increase the likelihood of African Americans voting by mail, because we are actually one of the least likely communities to use it because we have legitimate skepticism because we were the most likely to have our ballots thrown out. But we also have to recognize that we have to meet people at the point of their need and the point of their information, which is why it's so critical that we treat the HEROES Act not simply as a funding mechanism to create opportunities for voting, but it's also an opportunity to create information for education. And we have to use this moment between now and November to educate voters about what's at stake, why it's at stake, and how they can act to make it so.
Let me ask a follow-up on that then, because we talk about how do we build trust, how do we make sure that we're creating levels and measures of access, how are we making sure that people are being accountable and being both accountable and also being accounted for within the community. This is also, in many ways, when you think about how this then is a natural progression from even the work that you were doing before, thinking about the census, right? About how do we make sure that people are actually being counted and that resources are then following where the numbers are counting from. Where do you see the parallels existing in terms of how we thought about making sure that people got census and making sure that people are actually going out and voting? Where do you see those parallels and kind of those concentric circles and things that we can leverage to make sure that on both of those two fronts, which are both incredibly important to BEA, both incredibly important to our country, that we can actually be successful in those mechanisms?
So in the wake of the 2018 election, I created 3 organizations: the Constellation of Fair Fight, which is Fair Fight Action, which is our C4, and Fair Fight 2020, which is our 18-state strategy covering 100 million voters. And we built an infrastructure to protect access to the right to vote and to encourage advocacy and engagement in those states. And we are working in partnership with dozens of organizations, including Sherrilyn Ifill, through our C4 and the nonprofit work we do, to make certain that the right to vote is protected in the United States, but also expanded, because we can't simply hold serve. We need to expand access to the right to vote. But I also created Fair Count because I became Democratic leader in Georgia in November of 2010. So I took over 2 weeks after basically the worst election for Democrats in the history of Georgia. We lost every statewide office. We lost the Senate to a supermajority, and the House was within a few votes of Republicans having a 2/3 majority, so they could pass anything they wanted. But it was also at the tail end of the census. The census had been completed, the data was being compiled, and there was already whispers about the fact that there had been a deep undercount of African-American populations in Georgia, especially African-American men. I saw the result when I became the leader and headed into my first, I did my major legislative session that January, but August was the redistricting session. And I watched how they, with surgical precision, packed African Americans into a smaller number of districts, cracked communities so that they couldn't coalition, and scattered other communities of color so they could never aggregate enough power. And it was legal because under the Voting Rights Act, we had to be able to prove that these communities were being divided or packed. And the problem was because the census was wrong, because these people were invisible, because entire subdivisions were not included, then I did not have the necessary proof to file litigation to challenge those maps. We were simply invisible. We could drive to those neighborhoods, but we could not prove that they existed because they were not included in the census. And so in November of 2018, it was my intention to not treat these as separate conversations and not even as parallel, but they are intersectional. The power that we gain by voting is only distributed, but based on the districts that are created through the census and the financing that comes to our communities. And we know that the undercount of Black communities, just the expected undercount before COVID, was going to cost us $3.3 billion every year. That number is now astronomical because we know that the first communities that were dropped out of the process were African-American communities, Black communities writ large when you add in Black immigrants. We have to stop thinking about the census as a statistical event that happens every 10 years. This is a process that lasts for a decade. And if it's a process that lasts for a decade, then we've got to pay attention to it the entire time, because conservatives they have weaponized the census. They intentionally underfunded it for the first time in a decade. They struck out the 39,000 question centers that would have helped lift up participation in the census. We know that rural Blacks have been left out of receiving even the packets they're supposed to receive because of the update and leave program being delayed. And we know that young Black children are also the most likely to be undercounted, as well as Black men. So we've launched things like Sisters for the Census, Black Men Count. We are working with faith organizations, embedding them not only with giving them, especially in Georgia, we've given them access not only to Wi-Fi so that they could serve in communities without access. We actually built a technology with the help of a very strong BEA member. And we were able to build a technology and distribute it to faith communities throughout the country so that they can use it to share information. This combination of activities can be replicated in every community, in every state, but we know that 58% of Black people are in the South, which means that we have to have the most intentional focus here, because shockingly, at the exact same time, these are the states that do not have any state investment or nominal state investment in the census. So if we don't do it for ourselves, it will not happen. By comparison, California spent more than $180 million on one state. If you combine the entire investment across the southern states, if it hits $2 million, I'd be surprised.
So Sherrilyn, Stacey just mentioned certain places that are doing well, and I know that both from the work of LDF, but also from you personally, if things are going wrong, you're going to call them out. But if things are going right, you'll call that out as well too, as examples. What are the things that you are looking at, that you're seeing as some of the examples that we should be paying attention to, whether it be jurisdictions, organizations, et cetera, that we should be paying attention to saying like, they've got it and they figure out a way to actually scale right?
Well, the examples are very precious few. And I think that Stacey has actually explained why, because we have been so late to actually explain to people what voter suppression is. And we have been so late to understand how these things that seem like annoyances, like the census, are related to power, are related to political power. So I love the work that Fair Fight is doing in trying to get that word out. But the truth is, we are in a very perilous moment. And so one of the things that we've done is we've tried to put together and really just list the things that we think need to happen this summer. And if I leave with nothing else, it's like trying to put this all together. And this is all drawn from different places around the country that are doing different pieces of this. But this is, how do we deal with all of the issues that we've been talking about within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic? Because honestly, this is the game changer, right? I mean, in 1980, my first job as a grown-up, as an 18-year-old, was as a census enumerator. I had the little bag strapped across me, and I walked around Queens with my little team, and we were census enumerators knocking on doors. And I knew then how vital it was for people to trust you. It was important to have census enumerators from your own community who would trust who would have the trust of people, who would open their door and tell you how many people lived in the household and so forth. And I thought that was so vitally important. Now we're in the COVID-19 pandemic, in which people don't even want to open the door to their cousin, right, if the person doesn't have a mask on, and in which we have been advised that we should stay at home. And so that means we are driving people to do the census online. We know that our own community has issues around the digital divide. In some of our litigation we've been doing in Louisiana around distance learning, you know, we note that 18% of African-American households in Louisiana do not have a computer. So when people just say, do it online, we know that that is difficult for some of us. So what we've been saying is this year we have to have all of the access issues. We can't put all of our apples into one basket. So this relates to both voting and the census. In the voting context, we are pushing for mail-in voting. I just told you we have, you know, 3 pieces of litigation happening at the same time: South Carolina, Louisiana, and Alabama, where we're challenging the restrictions on absentee ballots that require you to have 2 witnesses, that require you to notarize your absentee ballot, that require you in Alabama to also submit a photo ID with your absentee ballot, and so forth, that don't have absentee ballot drop-off centers. We want to make sure that what we saw in Wisconsin, where people had to choose between their health and life and their ability to vote in that primary, we all saw that. I have said I'm forever changed by Wisconsin. I see those pictures of people standing on that line, and we have to do better. We have to be able to give people options. But the truth is, many in our community don't want to vote by mail. They don't trust voting by mail. They want to vote in person. We saw this in Chicago with the primary this year, and many of them are elderly voters. So this year we've been saying we need the full menu. And that means that we need, if people are going to vote in person, they have to be able to do so in a way that is safe. And so what do we need for people to be able to vote safely in person? Well, first and foremost, we need to make sure that the polling place itself is a place of integrity. And that means that there's a protocol that these jurisdictions, Stacey referenced 50 states, well, within those 50 states are all the different counties and all the county election boards that it cascades down to, and trying to make sure that they are ensuring that the polling place itself has been cleaned and sanitized on election day. Making sure that poll workers are trained in how to manage voting during the pandemic. Most of you know that most poll workers are elderly. We need to be bringing more young people into working as poll workers and training them. And that means outreach that should be happening right now this summer when the training is happening for polling workers. We need to be able to reassure poll workers that they will have PPE on election day, that we have gloves for them, and that we have masks for them. We don't want to risk our elderly people who want to work on polling on election day either. So that means we have to have a whole set of protocols around the polling place itself. This year, you know, LDF, every year we do this election protection work that we call Prepared to Vote. And this year we're saying that those words have special meaning, because you cannot wake up this year on November 2nd and decide you're going to vote on November 3rd. No, because if you're going to vote in person, you need to have your PPE, you need to have your mask and your gloves. So you need to have thought about it before you woke up and decided that I really like this candidate or another. So you have to have your PPE. We're encouraging people to have looked at the ballot, to have pulled down that ballot on Sunday night, and to have read through the ballot and to know who you want to vote for, because that's how we reduce long lines. That's how we reduce the amount of time you have to spend in the polling booth. If you go in that booth and that's the first time you're reading the bond measures, the first time you're reading who's running for sheriff, the first time you're reading who's running for school board, no, that needs to all be done before you get to the polling place. And then, of course, if you want to vote absentee, you have to order your absentee ballot. I don't know about you, Wes. I ordered my absentee ballot for Baltimore. I'm still waiting. I still don't have my absentee ballot.
Me too.
That's right. So it takes time for your absentee ballot to come. We were told mid-May, and you know, here we are. So you need to order your absentee ballot well in advance in time for it to come. That gives you a chance to then go through and actually fill out the ballot and then send it back in within the prescribed time. Now we're suing to expand that prescribed time so that people can get their votes back in time. But that was unsuccessful in Wisconsin, right? In Wisconsin, the effort was to try to extend the period of time in which voters were able to return their absentee votes, and the Supreme Court said no. So we know that we have to prepare this year. And so I think for those who are engaged in mobilization work and are interested in all of these issues of voter suppression and are interested in issues like the census, where Stacey just said we have to do it ourselves, We have to prepare, our communities have to be prepared to vote this year. And that means for us that we are leaning in heavy in September. If you want to vote in November, you need to start thinking about it in September, because you need to know when is the date when I have to order my absentee ballot for it to get to me on time. You have to make sure that you have access to PPE. We're working this summer to make sure that these poll workers are trained and that the polling places have protocols. So we really have to get out ahead of what we normally do. It's not going to be enough to be ready on election day to deal with voter suppression, right? We have to be ready in advance. We're pushing for expanded early voting, which is another way that we can protect ourselves and reduce lines and reduce exposure to COVID. So there's a whole menu of pieces that we're pulling from all over. And I will say, this is not just geographic. Many of you know that, New York just got early voting, right, last year. New York just got no excuse absentee voting. There are 39, 2/3 of states have no excuse absentee voting, but a bunch of other states, you have to actually explain what is the reason that you're not going to be able to be present on election day. And in places like South Carolina and Texas, they're saying that fear of COVID is not a sufficient excuse to get an absentee ballot. So we're going to be doing that litigation all summer. We're leaning in, we're pressing, but it's also going to be critical that our communities are being assisted and supported in preparing to vote this year, which is going to require more of us and more advanced work than we've ever done before. And the same is true for the census, where we're going to have to encourage our communities to go online, but we're also going to have to take this all the way to the finish mark in terms of getting people out who can go door to door to those tough spots where we know people don't have broadband, knock on doors and get those numbers in. Because as Stacey points out, that's the political power. That's going to set the landscape for political power for the next 10 years. And I'll just add one more thing. When we talk about the census and what it means in terms of allocation of resources to various communities, try to imagine what resources we are going to need post-COVID. We are seeing the reports that even people who recover from COVID, in many instances, are left with a 30% reduced lung capacity. We are facing the possibility of a segment of the Black population that will be permanently disabled as a result of having had COVID and recovering from COVID, whether it's kidney disease or liver disease or any other kinds of illnesses. Are we ready for that? Do we have the health care? Do we have the hospital access? Do we have all of the resources that we need to imagine that new normal of a population in which a significant portion of the population is permanently disabled as a result of having engaged with this pandemic? That also is a question that is deeply connected to the census and making sure that we are counted.
And Wes, if I can add two pieces. One is, just to put a fine point on it, right now the Black community is 15% behind the white community in response rates for the census. That 15% is unlikely to accelerate unless there is deep attention. Now, luckily in the HEROES Act, there's an attempt to, there's legislation that will extend the collection period. Right now, the census is legally going to end August 14th. The legislation is trying to extend it to October 31st. That should happen. But at the same time, there is an attempt by the Republicans to insert language that would allow for citizen voting age population data to be delivered to the states in 2021. The reason that's a problem is that means they don't have to count anyone for redistricting. When they're for reapportionment, they have to count everyone. For congressional redistricting, they have to count everyone. But for every other level of government in any state that does not by constitution or by law require total population, they can do what's called citizen voting age population. 50% of Americans under the age of 15 are Black. Are people of color. And the largest segment other than the Hispanic is African American. That means they don't have to include Black children, Black families, Black immigrants in the actual drawing of those districts. So you could have a school district that is majority Black in terms of population that goes to school, but the citizen voting age population is majority white, which means you lose any representation on those school boards. City council, county commission. And Georgia is one of those states. Texas is one of those states. Alabama is one of those states. And so we have to pay very close attention to the fact that the further behind we lag, the more likely it is that we are going to be shoved out of the next decade of resources, but also the next decade of political power. The concomitant challenge is also if you saw the New York Times yesterday, Fair Fight has been working on this with a number of organizations. The GOP, the RNC, the Republican National Committee, for the first time in 40 years, can engage in ballot security efforts. The last time they did this in 1981 in New Jersey, they had off-duty officers wearing black armbands, carrying walkie-talkies and firearms. They put up signs saying you're being monitored, and that's how they intimidated Black and brown voters out of participation. It was so egregious, they were put under a consent decree that got updated 4 times because of just how poorly they treated Black and brown voters in terms of intimidation, largely African-American voters. It is now legal for the RNC to spend as much money as they want, both hard and soft dollars, on voter intimidation starting in this election. And they've already allocated $60 million for voter intimidation strategies. They have a plan to get 50,000 people signed up to do poll watching. So to Sherrilyn's point, not only do we need to make certain that folks can vote by mail, but the ones who need to vote in person because they're disabled, they're homeless, they're displaced, they have a language barrier, or they can't trust the system, they're going to be met at the polling location by the RNC and their well-funded army. And so we can't simply be proactive. We also have to be prepared for defense. And that is something that, unfortunately, on our side of the conversation, we are very bad at doing this. And so part of the urgency I feel, and part of the reason I'm so excited about the coalition of groups that have come together and started working together in 2019 on this issue, is that typically we don't think about voter suppression until October. And by then it's too late. But if we do this work now, if we have the support that we need now, we can not only anticipate what's going to happen, we can fight back and we can win.
So I have one final question for both of y'all. And I asked we can keep it to a minute so I don't get yelled at by David. But here's the question, and it's to both of you. There might be people who are watching this right now and saying, you know, despite giving to Fair Fight, despite giving to LDF, and despite giving to BEA, what can I do to be able to combat this right now? How can I make my voice heard besides going out and voting and making sure your voice heard? And despite, you know, in addition to going and make sure that your census is put in, everybody in your household and in your homes is counted. What can individuals do right now to be able to support this cause and to support this movement and to make sure that we actually can have a fair and equitable and transparent election and the government that our country actually deserves then going in 2020 and beyond?
Number one, if you sign up with Fair Fight and Fair Count, we can put you to work. Fair Fight just had a weekend of action where we called more than 87,000 Georgians to explain to them how to vote by mail. We have to remember that for our communities, education is the primary impediment to participation. If we don't understand it, we are more likely to not do it because the fear of consequences are real. And so, number one, if you sign up with our organization, and it's probably true for LDF, we can use your volunteer skills. Absolutely. The same thing is happening with Fair Count. We're going to launch a virtual bus tour in June, and that virtual bus tour is going to include calling into families, calling into households, getting people to fill out the census, getting them the information they need. We need your voice. The second is that you need to call your senator and you need to demand action on the HEROES Act. That HEROES Act is critical because it funds $400 million extra dollars for the census. Those dollars are for our communities so that the information that needs to come to our communities to increase our participation show up. It pays for elections in all 50 states. If we don't get those resources, our elections will not work. So volunteer and call your senator. And if we do those two things, we are on the pathway to stronger elections.
Sherrilyn.
So I would absolutely co-sign on the HEROES Act. One other thing the HEROES Act does is provide funding for the United States Postal Service. Hard to imagine how we vote by mail without a fully funded postal service. This is vitally important, should be particularly important to the BEA because the Postal Service is also a very important employer of African Americans. 39%, I believe, of the workforce of the United States Postal Service are people of color, 40% are women. These are solidly middle-class jobs, but more importantly, we need the Postal Service. You need the Postal Service if you don't have direct deposit to get your stimulus check, but you need the Postal Service to be able to utilize your mail-in ballot. So we need you to call your senator about this piece of legislation, both of your senators about this piece of legislation, whether you live in a red state or a blue state. People love the United States Post Office. It is the most popular government agency, and this is pure politics and simply cannot be allowed to happen. So that's vitally important. The second piece that Stacey said about signing up, absolutely. Please go to naacpldf.org. Please remember we are a separate organization from the NAACP. We are the Legal Defense Fund, so naacpldf.org. And through our Prepare to Vote or Voting Rights Defender project, we can put you to work as well. We are focused in the South. That's where 90% of our work is. We are training volunteers. We're preparing for Election Day. If you join our team, there'll be an app that you can download that will allow you to get information to Command Central. We file litigation well in advance, but we also file it in real time. When we find out something is happening, we're filing litigation on Election Day. When Stacey talks about those challenges, these people, they're not going to call it voter intimidation. They're going to call it ballot security. And when they are walking up to people and asking them if they're registered, we've been seeing some of the protests happening and some of the confrontations happening. This is the dress rehearsal for Election Day. And so we have to be able to have people who are ready, who are prepared, who are documenting, even if you are socially distanced from your car and you're taking those videos so that we can get into court and do what we need to do. The last thing I want to say, because LDF is a nonpartisan organization, is I want to say something about the framing of this and the importance of not losing the racial discrimination dimension. Because I can tell you that when we appear before judges, they don't mind capturing all of this as partisan politics. That makes it easy for them. But I want to be clear with you that voter suppression at its root is about racial voter suppression. The people that they find the easiest to remove from the rolls and to place barriers in front of are African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans. We are the low-hanging fruit for them. We are the reliable people that they can disenfranchise. And we are the people who have the most to lose, especially in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to encourage you to be sure that we don't fall for the idea that this is just about politics as usual. It allows people to roll their eyes and walk away, and allows people to see this as something that's just part of our everyday lives, as opposed to unacceptable and illegal racial discrimination. And at LDF, our job is to make sure nobody forgets it. We were just in court last week in Florida in our virtual trial, trying to get the right restored to formerly incarcerated persons. And even when the judge didn't like it, we kept putting on our evidence about intentional racial discrimination in the passage of a law meant to undermine the restoration of that vote. We have to still make our record on race because we know that it's important. And at the end of the trial, it was interesting to hear the judge begin to acknowledge that evidence. That's where we come in, because we are unafraid and unrelenting in our determination to make sure that we frame this carefully and correctly. There is a reason that there was a Voting Rights Act, and it wasn't because of Republicans and Democrats. It was because of racial voter suppression and intimidation. And that's what we're dealing with today. So I'm just grateful to all of you for joining and for being so interested in this issue. And please follow me on Twitter. I always have good information for you that's up to date. Go to naacpldf.org, support Fair Fight, support LDF. And if we don't do it this year, I don't know when we would marshal ourselves to do what we must do.
Follow Sherrilyn on Twitter. It'll change your life. I'm telling you. Sherrilyn and Stacey, bless you both. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your commitment. Thank you for not just pushing us to be better, but every day for making us better. And to all of you who have joined this, thank you so much for your support of BEA and for all that you continue to do to strengthen our union and to focus on this idea of prosperity for Black Americans in wages, work, and wealth. Have a great day, everybody.